On May 28, 1988, at Moscow's Vnukovo airport, something is seen that no one could have imagined until recently. The American presidential plane Air Force One. President Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy step off the plane. This marks the beginning of the fourth meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev, but it is the first time it will take place on Soviet soil. The highest representatives of the Soviet Union and the United States will sign a treaty here on the significant reduction of short-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles, but something else is even more important. It is obvious that the Cold War between the two countries, which had shaped events on our planet for 40 years, is coming to an end. And although it might seem at first glance to be a mutually acceptable draw, the opposite is true. In reality, it is a crushing American victory, which will soon be confirmed by the collapse of the Soviet Empire in Eastern and Central Europe occupied for 40 years, and then by the demise of the Soviet Union itself. So a few days later, when Reagan and Gorbachev walked through a crowd of local people applauding in the square, talking and joking with them, it's actually a huge paradox. That applause and waving of small flags belongs to the man who, with his uncompromising policy, managed to overpower their country, economically exhaust it, and impose a peace model according to his own terms. That is precisely why Ronald Reagan is considered today to be the person who played the biggest role in the fall of communist regimes throughout Eastern and Central Europe. He was born in Tampico, Illinois, with only cornfields all around. His dad was a boiler tender and was often unemployed. His mum was very devout. Ronald was the middle of 3 sons. He did very well in school, was diligent, but never had many friends. He completed both high school and his bachelor's degree at a university in Illinois, then started working as a radio reporter in neighboring Iowa. Here, he effectively used his storytelling talent, which he had since childhood. For example, he would comment on baseball games based only on snippets of information he received via telegraph, and he would vividly imagine the rest. It is said that once, when the telegraph went out, he completely fabricated the development of a fairly long passage of the game. In 1937, he was in California on business and went for a screen test at Warner Brothers Studios, and he succeeded. He was handsome, had an athletic build, a pleasant voice and demeanor, and a kind smile. He got his first role that same year in the movie Love is on the Air, and gradually starred in 6 to 10 films a year. Most of his characters were likable good guys. Some of the films were successful in their time, but he never received a nomination for any major film awards, unlike his first wife, Jane Wyman, whom he met in 1938 while filming Brother Rat. She went on to win an Oscar and 3 Golden Globes. During World War II, Reagan avoided deployment in Europe due to an eye condition, and instead worked in the Army's film propaganda department. After the war, he became president of the Screen Actors Guild and led it at a time when the hunt for communists began in America. Especially in Hollywood, lists of real and suspected communists and their sympathizers were being created, and they were losing their jobs, being interrogated, publicly shamed, and in some cases, even imprisoned. Reagan, although always careful with his words, sided with those who were carrying out the purges. As revealed after the year 2000, he even used the code name T10 to identify some colleagues to FBI agents. This might have been influenced by the fact that in the turbulent year of 1947, left-wing studio workers openly threatened the studios. In any case, this definitively marked the transformation of a convinced Democratic Party voter and admirer of President Roosevelt into a sworn anti-communist. At the same time, a turning point also came in his personal life. He divorced Jane Wyman, and 4 years later he would marry Nancy Davis, with whom he would stay until the end of his life. In 1957, they starred together in the movie Hellcats of the Navy. By that time, however, Ronald Reagan was already more famous from television than from film. He hosted a regular show on CBS called General Electric Theater, which were half-hour adaptations of short stories or plays sponsored by General Electric. Reagan himself starred in some episodes, but mainly he always had the opening and closing remarks. And considering that these were essentially sponsored messages, we must appreciate even today how pleasant and professional he was in doing it. Thanks to this show, which he later produced himself, Reagan also became wealthy.
And now, Ronald Reagan.
Good evening.
Tonight, General Electric devotes its entire program to an exciting half-hour musical production
Besides
starring
that,
Judy
he also
Garland.
worked as a motivational speaker for the sponsoring company. And during his 8-year collaboration, he traveled essentially all over America and would speak to 250,000 General Electric employees. The skills he acquired here would serve him well after entering politics in the first half of the 1960s. He became a representative of the most conservative wing of the Republican Party, and in 1966, he won the gubernatorial elections in California. After his election, he acted very decisively and also made many enemies, perhaps most notably when he forcefully suppressed protests in Berkeley in 1969. The live ammunition that the police units received caused the death of one person, and the subsequent deployment of 2,000 members of the National Guard was considered by the protesters, mostly students from the local university, to be a brutal crackdown on democratic freedoms. Nevertheless, Reagan weathered it. In 1970, he was re-elected governor, and then he went on to try for the highest office. In 1976, he fought for the Republican nomination for president, but narrowly lost to the incumbent President Ford. However, in 1980, he was back. And this time, both leaders advanced to the final showdown. Many considered him poorly educated and too simplistic, but in the debates with his opponent, President Jimmy Carter, he showed how perfectly he could address his audience. For example, he would juggle classic economic terms like crisis, recession, and recovery, which his opponent mentioned as one of his key themes.
A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose yours. And recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his.
He ultimately completely crushed his opponent, winning in 44 states. And on January 20th, 1981, a few days before his 70th birthday, he became the 40th President of the United States of America. He would defend the presidential office in the following elections. He would defeat Mondale even more decisively than he had defeated Carter 4 years earlier, and would thus spend almost the entire 1980s in the White House. Although he was initially quite underestimated, he very quickly showed that he was a politician who had a completely clear vision of the world he wanted to promote, and was not afraid to take responsibility or be criticized for it. When air traffic controllers in America decided to strike, he had 11,000 of them fired and partially replaced them with military personnel. The catastrophic scenarios did not materialize, and he celebrated a great success. He also introduced a completely new economic policy, for which the name Reaganomics became established. He dramatically cut taxes, especially for the wealthiest, which sparked strong economic growth. Together with this, he also cut social programs, which, however, also led to increasing inequality between rich and poor Americans. Experts still debate today whether Reagan's economic model was in its own way brilliant, or whether it was precisely he who caused many negative phenomena in the future. Various scandals also emerged. The most famous was the discovery that Reagan's administration was secretly selling weapons to hostile Iran despite an international embargo, and using the money obtained to finance rebel groups fighting against the left-wing government in Nicaragua. However, Reagan weathered even this affair, which could have broken another person. Not in vain did the way with which he managed to sweep all unpleasant topics off the table earn him the nickname the Teflon President. Perhaps the most difficult moments he experienced were just 96 days after his first inauguration. That's when a mentally ill 26-year-old John Hinckley tried to shoot him because he wanted to attract the attention of actress Jodie Foster, with whom he was platonically in love. He fired 6 shots at the president, seriously injuring him, as well as 2 members of the Secret Service and White House Press Secretary Brady. Reagan had a punctured lung, but after surgery, his condition began to improve rapidly, and this attacker was found not guilty by reason of insanity and confined to a psychiatric clinic, from where he was released after 35 years in 2016. There was a lot that happened during Reagan's administration, but none of it compares to his policy towards the other superpower of that time, the Soviet Union. He was not afraid to publicly call it an evil empire and completely abandon the path of cautious diplomacy and concessions that his predecessors had followed. One of his advisors later recalled that he first heard the phrase, "win the Cold War" from Reagan. Until then, no one had apparently even considered it in these terms. And Reagan approached it in his own way. Simply put, he decided to unleash such an arms race that would economically cripple the Soviet Union. His task was made easier by the fact that in Moscow, they considered him from the beginning to be a gunslinger who was completely unpredictable and fundamentally capable of anything. So when he began deploying intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe and later followed up with the SDI program, often called Star Wars, which was supposed to be able to intercept any missile fired at the United States, the Soviet leadership was alarmed. Essentially, it had no other option than to also arm itself, but its economic power was not sufficient for that. At that time, up to 40% of Soviet state expenditures went to armaments, and that could not be sustained for long. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, a representative of a new way of thinking, came to the Kremlin, and relations between the two superpowers and their highest representatives began to improve. Reagan knew he was close, but at the same time he realized that right now, when the Soviet Union was practically on its knees, the most dangerous stage was coming, and so he did not slacken in his initiative.
If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And then in May 1988, during his visit to Moscow, he signed a treaty on the limitation of nuclear weapons together with Mikhail Gorbachev. Both countries agreed on something like this for the very first time. It is a breakthrough moment, and for Reagan, the fulfillment of a goal that was to force the Soviets to peace. So a few months later, when he formally handed over the office to his successor, George Bush, Ronald Reagan could leave the scene as the victor of the Cold War. He fulfilled a mission that no one before had dared to even name.